You're live.
Okay, welcome everybody to the online Café Sci, the cyber cafe scientifique, which we take the name scientifique because Café Scientifique was founded years ago in Bristol and has since gone global, and it's a movement of informal science venues. And the scientifique, I think, was because that sounded more sort of posh and meaningful and French philosophical. We normally call it Café Sci, and this is the online version of that. But today we have a French speaker, Etienne Fortier-Dubois, who's from Montreal in Canada, so not the real France, but a sort of simulation of France out there. And I'm very pleased to have Etienne talk to us, because the reason I asked him to do a talk here is that he posted a thread, which is like a sequence of comments on Twitter about the miracle of cake. And when people do that kind of thing, it can be absolutely fascinating, mainly because it's the kind of thing that most of us never think about. And there's almost always a lot of interesting detail to it. So that's your topic, isn't it, Etienne? Today is cake, yes?
Yes, it came just as an idea for me. It's just this interesting fact that there's all these ordinary things that we take for granted, but if you stop and look at where they come from, I think there's a lot of very interesting stuff to be found.
Yeah, and Etienne does a blog which is in English, and it's called Dark Grey Matters, that is. So look that up. He's also got a Twitter handle, EtienneFD, and you can find him on there, and he does interesting things. And he's part of something Tech Writer Fellowship. Just before we start your talk, Etienne, can you just say what Writer Fellowship is?
Sure. It's basically a group, a community of writers organized around this organization called On Deck from California. They are there to try to form this group of peers that will help each other writing online. This has been a great experience so far for me, and it sort of kickstart my writing online, my blog, as Chris mentioned, for instance.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a number of writing groups, like I think they're usually called something like Write On, but they're usually writers. And in my experience, they seem to be usually writing fiction and quite out there fiction. It's interesting to see a similar thing. So On Deck Writer Fellowship, is that scientific, or is that all kinds of writing?
It's all kinds. It's very steeped into the Silicon Valley kind of culture. So a lot of people writing about startups, about business and technology, but there's also a bunch of other people trying new ways also to write. There's a bunch of people writing newsletters. I also started writing one just yesterday, actually. Things that you write and that will end up in your subscribers' inbox right at the moment you publish it. So this is like sort of a new type of writing that's been becoming very popular this year, for instance. So lots of people writing lots of things, not just business and tech, in like all sorts of formats.
That's interesting, yeah. And Etienne is not a specialist in cake, but he wrote very interestingly about cake. And when I invited him to talk at Café Sci, he was very happy to do so. And then when I started promoting it, he rather humbly sort of said something like, you know, it's funny how when you don't know anything about something, but you're just interested, you suddenly become an expert. And actually, I think that kind of sums up the Café Sci that I love most, which is that you do not have to be an incredible established expert in a field to be interesting or to raise people's interest in it. You just have to be interesting and interested, and it starts a conversation. And that's what the organizer of Café Sci right back in the beginning was after. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a talk delivering like tablets of stone and the formed wisdom, but it was starting a conversation about something that was interesting. And that's why you're here, Etienne. But actually, what you wrote about cake was totally fascinating. So can I start you off on it? You started off on something called a pound cake. And I think a pound cake is probably a Canadian or American thing more than more than British. I might be wrong on that. So I'm going to hand over to you to lead us through the miracle of cake.
Sure. I don't know how British or not British the name is. The pound cake, though, is this very, very simple, actually simple in terms of ingredient. Simple cake that was invented, I think, in Northern Europe a few centuries ago. It's very simple because there's only 4 ingredients and in equal amounts by weight. Traditionally, I think 1 pound each, though I've seen other sources say the sum of the 4 ingredients should be 1 pound. So I don't know which one is the correct version. If you take 1 pound of each, it's probably going to make a pretty massive cake. So the 4 ingredients are, well, they're flour, sugar, eggs, and butter. And so what I did in this Twitter thread is go in small, for very small, like just 1 tweet, 1 comment on each ingredient, not actually naming the ingredient, but like looking into where they come from and how kind of absurd in a way it is that we actually have these very, very complicated paths from like where they're from in the natural world to ending up in a pound cake. So for instance, the first ingredient, it's this grass that grows in many places, but originally in the Middle East. There's a bunch of grasses there. And at some point, people decided that this grass, if you harvest it when it's ripe and you grind the little grains that come in the ears, I think that's the word, at the end, and you remove then part of the powder to end up with this very, very white powder, then this is an ingredient you can use to make lots of things like bread or like cake. I think that's kind of fascinating. So this is the story of basically domesticating wheat and other grains as well. And then there's a second plant that's used in making a cake, and that plant, I mean, there's actually many options for this one. We're making sugar basically, and the traditional, well, there's many sources for sugar, which is basically a molecule, can be made of smaller molecules like glucose, and like the main source of it worldwide is sugar cane, which is this other grass that grows in a totally different area of the world, like totally unrelated to the Middle Eastern grass that we talked about. It comes from Asia, probably India or Southeast Asia. I mean, it's a little complicated story where exactly these plants come from. And to get it, the part you want is actually this juice in the stem. So it has these like large stalks that you need to take and process them in an actually fairly labor-intensive way, which is like a path the discussion could take. Labor-intensive in sometimes kind of dark ways. Of course, slavery was big in parts of the world because of sugarcane cultivation and processing. But then, of course, now we have industrial processes to do this for us, and you turn this juice that is in the stalks into these little tiny crystals. There's also other things you can turn it into, like molasses, like maybe less refined powder, which is like browner crystals, so many different kinds. But the ones you want to do the pound cake is this very, very refined white crystal thing, which is sugar. Of course, all these things seem very obvious, but like it's fun to like see where did that come from, right? Then this third ingredient in the pound cake is the egg. I sort of
sugar. Yes, so sugar has a bad reputation nowadays, doesn't it? That was something which sort of took over the whole world and created a slave trade, and then has made us all twice as large as we should be. Is that right?
Yeah, sugar is, I mean, it's a very, very basic thing we need to function as organisms, but there are many things wrong with sugar. It has a complicated history. Let's say this. There's other sources though. Sugarcane isn't actually the only one you need to use. And in fact, in northern countries, in temperate countries, this is the case in North America and most of Europe, the actual source of sugar is this other plant totally unrelated to the sugarcane, which is the sugar beet. This is a root that you can also process to extract exactly the same molecule in the end. This is actually a very, very much more recent invention. The sugarcane processing is something from the ancient world, probably started in India. reached Europe in the Middle Ages, I think, or it was known to like the ancient Greeks, I think, but became widespread with the trade networks that developed into the Middle Ages, and then became very, very widespread in the age of discovery, exploration, and also partly because of the slave trade. But the sugar beet is a much more recent thing. It's I think about 200 years only. It started being a big thing only in France after the revolution, and then spread to other temperate zones.
Yeah. And Sarah asks, is the sugar from cane and beet exactly the same sugar?
If you refine it, then yes, you end up with the exact same molecules. I'm not sure if the less refined steps would be maybe different a little bit. But I think you're extracting the same substance. This substance, which like glucose and also fructose and other molecules that compose different kinds of sugar, they're all over the place in the plant world. It's just that these are the sources that have the highest concentration of it.
Thank you.
Should I go on with the eggs then?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So eggs, I think eggs are so weird. They have this little shape, round, slightly elongated. Like I can't think of anything else that has this shape. And so the fact that they're actually a super key ingredient in most cuisines is kind of interesting. Of course, eggs have been eaten by humans since like the dawn of time, and even probably ancestors of humans. I mean, snakes eat eggs, right? It's just this. An egg is basically what an animal creates as nourishment for its progeny. So it's kind of obvious when you think about it that other animals will be very attracted by this big concentrated source of nutrients. So humans have probably eaten them, like found them in nests for a very, very, very long time. But the type of egg that we eat the most is this egg that comes from a bird called the jungle fowl, or at least the jungle fowl is the wild type. It comes from, I think, Southeast Asia or maybe India, like so same area maybe as the sugarcane. But of course, the domesticated version of the jungle fowl is something we call the chicken, which was probably domesticated for its eggs, actually. Like the main reason is the eggs. Of course, we can also eat the chicken, but that's another story. And then like even like inside the egg, I think it's such a weird thing. Like it has two parts, right? The like slimy, white, transparent part, and then there's the fat yellow part in the middle. For the pound cake, you'll actually need both. You need to separate them because they have different properties. The slimy one is more proteins, and you can mix it with air to create this fluffy thing that will allow your cake in the end not to be a brick. And then the other one provides fat, which is also very useful in cake. And then the last.
The chicken is a flightless bird.
That's right.
The chicken is a flightless bird. Yeah, like an ostrich.
That's right. Coincidence or not, we also eat ostrich eggs sometimes. I'm not actually sure what the jungle fowl's life or like habits are. Like, did the jungle fowl in the jungles of Asia fly? I guess not, but I'm not totally sure. I'm not actually sure also how this domestication happened. Like, I'm more familiar with other kinds of domestication. There are other types, though. I should mention, like for sugar, we can get eggs from like other birds. In Europe, chicken reached Europe like later since it came from Asia. So the eggs that people ate more was the quail, the much smaller quail egg. Let's keep going then. The fourth ingredient is butter. It's probably the most complicated ingredient when you think about it. Eggs you can just take from a nest, maybe. The other ones are just plants. I mean, they're complicated to process, but you can just grow the plant, buy a field, plant a bunch, and then eventually you harvest it. But the last one comes from female mammals. I suppose you could take any mammals. I mean, humans produce milk, obviously, but you want one that will produce a lot. And the one that, for various reasons, people get their milk from is the cow, or cattle, if you want to be gender neutral. And like getting milk, like for me, I drink milk every day, and it seems such a normal thing, but when you think about it, and I mean, if there are any vegans listening, they will be totally aware of this. But like, you actually need to like impregnate this female huge beast, and then it has a baby. Then you take away the baby. You don't need the baby for this. You take the food that the mammal was going to give to the baby, and then this food contains a bunch of things, but it contains one of the things is fat, so nutrients for the baby. And you separate this from the rest of the white liquid food, which is milk, and then you get this thing called cream, which then you can churn, and then you get this. It turns into this yellowish solid form that we call butter. And this is basically almost pure fat. I mean, not totally pure, but I think it's maybe 70 or 80% fat. And then, yeah, what the first thing you'll do is actually melt it. So like put it back in liquid form. And then you can use this in various recipes, like a cake. So,
and you make a very good argument for veganism there, with the poor babies being deprived of their milk and so on. These are quite strange things to contemplate, in a way, the things that we do to animals in order to feed ourselves, and especially with something that's a luxury like cake.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't necessarily want to go deep in that direction, because it does tend to have implications, and then like moral implications that we need to think about. But it's true that most people might not actually be aware that to get milk, we actually need to have the cow have a baby. And I mean, the whole dairy farming industry has optimized this, and like then you can use the baby for other things as well. But yeah, this is a thing that must be done to get this butter. So now we have our 4 ingredients. This cereal powder that we got from the Middle East, these little crystals from tropical areas, this nourishment for the embryo of a bird from Asia, and then this fat from a liquid that a mother mammal wanted to give its baby. And then you can combine them in a very specific way, right? There are very specific steps. You can just do whatever. You need to, as I said, separate the eggs into these 2 parts, like beat the eggs to put some air in it, and mix it with the butter. I mean, mix the white parts, I think, with the butter and the sugar. And then, I mean, there's this is what we call the recipe. And then we need to apply some energy. We could get into how to actually get energy to make your cake. But this is a whole totally different story. Getting the tools as well. But like, just the fact that we have this information, knowing how much time to cook it, to bake it, how much time to, in what order doing this, what the quantities, which is, as I said, just 1 of each. But if we get in more complicated cakes, the quantities of each ingredient are also important. And then this is all we need to get, in the end, this very simple cake.
And the recipe for a cake is, as you say, is quite specific. And I know something interesting about cakes, because in my first real commercial job, I was general manager of Good Housekeeping software, and we were working on a software program I think it was 1980s, a software program that never got released, which was cookery software, Good Housekeeping software. And being software engineers, we thought that's easy. A recipe is an algorithm, and we can scale it. The Good Housekeeping Institute were not very keen on linear scaling of ingredients. I mean, they pointed out that you couldn't really do half an egg and so on. But they had a principle that no recipe was ever published by Good Housekeeping that hadn't been tested. In other words, you couldn't just say, let's make a 2-pound cake by putting in twice the amount of ingredients, because for some cookery sort of reason, that just doesn't work. I mean, that's quite interesting, isn't it? It's not... There are very specific things that are learnt about cooking, and it seems that many of those things are only learnt by experiment and experience, and cannot simply be scaled or extrapolated.
I mean, you touched upon a very, very interesting argument, which is these things, all of what I said, the recipe, but also the domestication, also the culinary innovations to turn milk into butter, all these things happen mostly by trial and error. You can't really just look at the natural world and think, if we did this and this and this and this, then we would get this result, and then just go do it and it worked. Of course, it's not going to work. These things have taken centuries and millennia to actually get right. The pound cake recipe appeared maybe, I think, in the 1700s, but there must have been ancestors like other similar cakes before, and like after, it can also be still refined. This is something that I think, especially in the science world, we sometimes miss a little bit. We sort of want to think about things in a rational way and say, I predict that this will happen. Maybe it will, but like tinkering with stuff is actually how innovation probably happens most of the time.
So if we look at that in terms of, we just take this in the direction of science for a moment. I mean, it's been quite scientific, but when we do something just by experiment or by observation, if we look at something and think, I wonder how that happened, or I wonder what would happen if I do that, is that science?
I think it is.
And science at the moment seems to be something where you propose a hypothesis. Do you think when somebody thought, do you think I could take that white liquid from that animal and drink it and it would be healthy? Do you think they had a hypothesis, or do you think maybe someone just thought, I wonder what it'd be like if I did that?
Yeah, I mean, the scientific method as a thought process is fairly young, right? It's maybe appeared in the 1600s or so. Probably there were some ancestor ideas, maybe, for instance, in the Islamic Golden Age period. But I think most innovators, most people who actually invented stuff did not really think about this whole thought process. They were just trying things. And when something works, it sticks. And we touch upon here the idea of cultural evolution. You have a bunch of people just trying things. And when something is good, it's sort of, it's almost, in biological terms, it's like almost a positive mutation, like some new thing that is useful, maybe because it's healthy for you as food, or maybe because it helps you, whatever, hunt better because you created a new tool. And I think for most innovation, even today, that's how it happens. It's just these things that people find sort of by random, by chance, not necessarily all chance, but these processes that aren't really directed. Today, we are fond of very directed project and say, oh, I'm a government, I'm going to fund this project for $200 million or pounds, and hope that it will create this technology. Maybe it will, but like, I'm not sure you could actually invent a new very good cake recipe that people will actually want to create with like this sort of directed approach.
So you obviously are a cook. You can cook a pound cake. And before I let you go on, when you first cooked a pound cake, did it work according to the recipe exactly as you hoped?
After this Twitter thread became viral, I sort of thought, yes, I should probably make a pound cake, because I did not actually make one beforehand. I did follow a recipe. It worked well. I think it was slightly undercooked, but that's probably just a mistake I made. When a recipe is good, it's an idea that's been sort of validated and is spreading because people agree it's good. Maybe it's spread because of new mechanisms, like people rating it on a website, for instance, or just because your grandmother made this recipe and passed it to your mother and passed it to you. When an idea is good like this, it spreads, and it will work if you are, I mean, maybe it requires some skills and training, but if it's good, then you don't need to reinvent the whole thing.
Are you a keen cook? Do you cook a lot?
I do. I do cook a lot. I find it's a very pleasurable activity.
Yeah. So cooking a pound cake wasn't too much of a challenge for you?
No, I've baked actually much more complex cakes before.
I bet. Okay, I'll let you get on, because I know you weren't going to stop just at the recipe and so on.
Right. If I go back to the Twitter thread after this, after we've made this cake, I sort of mentioned other ingredients you could add, because as I said, there are much more complex cakes around, and this pound cake doesn't really have much of a taste. I mean, it will taste like fat and buttery, basically. One very, very common ingredient we add in baked goods is vanilla. Vanilla is, this blew my mind when I learned about it some years ago. It's actually the second most expensive spice in the world after saffron. And yet it's all over the place. The reason it's all over the place is probably because we managed to chemically, artificially create the main compound that gives the flavor of vanilla, which we call vanillin. So this allows us to have vanilla everything. But like, it's still kind of interesting to me that vanilla, which is almost considered a basic flavor, like, right? Vanilla ice cream is the basic kind of ice cream, and vanilla cake is the basic kind of cake. But vanilla is actually this orchid, I'm not sure, that grows. It's originally from Mexico, and it grows on trees. Like, it's basically like a vine. Orchid, I just checked. It grows on trees, and then it creates these like long brown beans that contain lots and lots and lots and lots of tiny fragrant seeds, which is what we want. And when you buy something that's made with fancier vanilla, it has all these little dots in it, right? And vanilla it's now grown mostly actually in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, and some surrounding islands. It's very labor intensive as well to get, which is why it's expensive. It has to actually be hand pollinated, except I guess not in Mexico, but since very, very little of it is actually made in its natural original place, then it needs to be hand pollinated in the places where it's made. So this is one option you can get to flavor your cake. The one I made the other day had some actually genuine vanilla in it. And then there's chocolate, cocoa. This is super complicated. I actually wrote a second thread. It didn't go viral, this one, but on making chocolate. This is this tree from also kind of the same area as vanilla. So like southern Mexico and Central America, I think northern South America as well. So this tree, which makes these fruits that are called cocoa pods, which contain beans that are really high in fat, but also these other compounds that give the brown color of chocolate and the very special bitter taste. And then you need the steps for processing this are like, they're kind of insane. It's like you need to dry them, you need to let them ferment. There's 3 different kinds of like chemical reaction of fermentation going on, all of this so you can get this paste that then you split into the cocoa butter, which is the fat, and then the cocoa solids, which is the brown flavory part, which to make chocolate, you sort of recombine in specific proportions. And then you're not done because there's like a bunch of other steps in like making solid chocolate. So like all this before the Maya and the Aztecs and the other Mesoamerican people before the arrival of the Europeans, they had figured out, and they drank it as a drink, a bitter drink. But then Europeans invented a solid sweet form of chocolate, and for this there's more steps like tempering. Tempering, I discovered this. It's when you want your chocolate to crystallize into solid form, but it can crystallize in 5 or 6 different ways, and you want just this one kind of crystal. It's just a very, very complicated thing. And then, like I mentioned, cinnamon as well in the thread, like other spices. The cultural evolution of spices is kind of amazing also. Like, we like spices, spicy stuff, things with like interesting flavors, not because they're good for us, like sugar, like that allows us to have energy, but just because they're antimicrobial. So people who would put more spices in their meals, especially in tropical areas, would have lesser chance of disease. So which is why eventually we came to like spices and spicy food. And cinnamon is one example, which is just this inner bark, not even the outer bark, but this inner bark of this tree that grows in India. And of course, the history of spices is also interesting on its own. Like, that's looking for spices is why the Europeans discovered the Americas. So yeah, there's like so many directions this can go in. There's like everything around us has like this super interesting history. And I mean, this is basically what I said in the thread. And the conclusion to this is basically we I touched upon this earlier, but like we had centuries and millennia to domesticate these and create these innovations. It's crazy when you first think about how we combine all these things, and then it makes sense, of course, when you think this is not a single person inventing this. Of course, this is very, very, very long process of accumulating good ideas, good mutations. If we were thinking about genetics, but it's not genetics, it's culture, which works in sort of similar rules, not identical, but sort of, which is something we can call cultural evolution. And I think this is why we can say cakes are a miracle, not a miracle in a religious sense. I mean, if you're religious and you think that all of this is a religious miracle, sure, why not? But they're a miracle in the sense that like the appearance of very complicated things is just amazing. It's just fun to see and think about.
Cakes as a miracle. Yeah, a lot of things are miraculous, really, aren't they? But they're very slow-moving miracles. Take a very, very long time to actually arise. And the interesting thing is, when you wrote your thread on Twitter, which prompted me to ask you to come and talk here, you hadn't baked a pound cake before.
I think I probably made one maybe years ago or something like that.
But you made one specially after. So you made a pound cake, you baked a pound cake after writing a fascinating thread about everything that goes into a pound cake and how complicated it all is and so on, but without having baked one.
I took it basically because it was simple, so it made for this good story, this very simple thing, 4 ingredients, and we're done. Otherwise, I would have had to write a longer thing saying how we got the chocolate, how we got this fruit or whatever you want to. I didn't expect this to like blow up and become this popular, but then I actually got like messages and tweets from people saying, "Oh, this inspired me to bake a cake." So I was like, "Okay, I think this is also inspiring myself to bake a cake."
Yeah, it's interesting. And the particular thread you did on baking, I mean, afterwards you've done threads on things like onions and other things, which are equally fascinating. But I think the pound cake one was the one that really blew up.
That's right. In terms of Twitter following,
yeah, so that
multiplied my following by 10 because people really like this.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? How many people retweeted it or passed it on?
Something like 4,000 retweets, like 10,000 people liked it. You can look at in Twitter, you can look at how many views your tweets got, and it's close to 1 million. All of this to me is like
okay, 1 million. Okay, and Etienne, what is your day job that you normally tweet about on Twitter?
I don't actually tweet very much about my day job, but I work as a software developer for a company that makes language software, grammar checking and spell checking software.
And when you tweet about something technical, how many people do you normally reach? 1 million, like you did with the pound cake?
No. It's by now I've accumulated a little following. Like I've some people engaging with my thoughts. I struggle with making my identity online very specific on something. Like I am a very curious person writing about a lot of different things. So like I can't really say what I tweet about. It's whatever I find interesting.
That's the whole point of Twitter, really.
Yeah. I do want to tweet more about from the cake thread, since it got popular, and I think this is a cool idea. As I said, I already tweeted about chocolate, and I want to do actually a more in-depth examination of like the ingredients, like other types of food. One thing I want to do is citrus fruit. And one of the comments I made in the follow-up to the cake thing, people were commenting, and there is this like maybe you want to flavor your cake with citrus, lemons, oranges, grapefruit, and these are also a very interesting world, because all the citrus fruit we eat are basically hybrids from a very small number of ancestral species. And I think this is something that's underappreciated, and I want to write more about this.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking to us. That was fascinating, as I expected it to be, and I'm very grateful to you for talking. Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I want to remind people that everyone who talks at a Cyber Cafe Sci or any Cafe Sci that I run is a volunteer. They do it because they enjoy it, they love it, or they want to communicate something. So we're incredibly grateful to people. If you want to, we have this rather crude way of expressing our applause by using the raise hand button, and it just does a sort of hand goes up and down thing to say thank you. And I'm sure we'd all like to thank Etienne for that. In a minute, I'm going to offer people, if you're okay with that, Etienne, the ability to join us just for a couple of minutes on a roundtable chat, if you're okay with that.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, before I do that, I just want to point out that Cyber Cafe Sci, you can find us on Twitter. You can also find us on Facebook. If you just look up Cyber Cafe Scientifique or cybercafe.science, that's all you have to type in a Google search. That will bring up the website with all the events that are coming up. We have a number of them planned, and we've got dinosaurs in January by the curator of the Natural History Museum. But in December, we have a talk by Michael J. Flick, Dr. Michael J. Flick, I think that's the correct name. And he's a medical doctor who's an expert on vitamin D. And vitamin D is quite topical at the moment because the UK government is very interested in its potential properties as a reduction, as a vitamin that may help with the reduction of symptoms of COVID. But of course, it's also been implicated in all sorts of other things. And Michael will be talking to us about what's actually quite an extraordinary story, a bit like Etienne's. Vitamin D is truly weird, and how it's created in our skin by sunlight, and how different that is from the vitamin that's created otherwise, and how different is the effect if it's created in your skin from if you ingest it through a vitamin tablet. And that will be on December the 12th. So that's a good one to look at on a sort of, food, nutrition, medical theme that's going on. And then in January, watch out for us doing something about dinosaurs, which is always popular. I'd like to thank the people who've joined us on Zoom and anyone who's joined us on the other streaming platforms, or people who are watching later on. Hope to see you again. And I'm going to thank Etienne once more. If those people who are on the Zoom session want to join us for a brief chat, if you use the raise hand button, then I'll take the time to promote you to a panelist, which means you'll just pop up on the screen. You don't have to, to show your video if you don't want to, but you can talk to us. Okay, but goodbye to all of those who are on live streaming services. We're going to turn that off now, I think. Yes.